What happens when a freed slave risks everything to buy the freedom of a white woman at an auction? The answer will shock you and reveal a conspiracy that threatened to destroy an entire community's hard-won liberty. Subscribe now to uncover stories that history tried to hide. The humid Georgia air hung thick with tension as the crowd gathered around the courthouse steps in Millbrook County on that sweltering July morning of 1867. 2 years had passed since the end of the Civil War, yet the echoes of the old world still reverberated through these dusty streets like ghosts refusing to rest. Elijah Turner stood at the edge of the crowd, his weathered hands gripping his worn leather hat. At 32, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had fought for every breath of freedom he now possessed. His dark eyes scanned the faces around him, some familiar, others hostile, all watching as the remnants of the Whitmore plantation were auctioned off piece by piece. The morning had started early for Elijah. He'd risen before dawn to complete his work at the sawmill, knowing that attending this auction would cost him a day's wages he could barely afford to lose. But something had compelled him to come, a nagging feeling that had kept him awake for the past 3 nights, ever since he'd heard whispers in the general store about the special items that would be sold today. As he stood there, Elijah's mind drifted to his sister Sarah, who lived 2 towns over with her husband and 3 children. She'd written to him just last week, expressing concern about strange men asking questions in her community, men with official-looking papers and smooth voices who spoke of opportunities and arrangements that sounded too good to be true. Sarah had always been the smart one in their family, and if she was worried, Elijah knew there was good reason to be. The crowd around him was a mixture of local farmers, merchants, and carpetbaggers from the north who had come south seeking opportunities in the aftermath of war. Elijah recognized most of the local faces. Some had been kind to him since his freedom. Others still looked at him with the barely concealed resentment of people who believed the natural order of things had been overturned. "Next item," called out auctioneer Morrison, a thin man whose voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to selling human lives. His pale face was slick with sweat, and his small eyes darted nervously over the crowd, as if he knew he was participating in something that skirted the edges of legality. One female, age approximately 22, skilled in household management and correspondence. Clara Whitmore, ward of the late plantation owner. Elijah's blood ran cold. There she was, standing on the wooden platform in a faded blue dress that had seen better days. Clara's auburn hair caught the morning sunlight, but her green eyes held a confusion that pierced straight through him. She wasn't supposed to be here. According to everything he'd heard, she was family. The old master's ward, practically his daughter. But Elijah knew better. He'd spent months piecing together fragments of conversations, stolen glances at documents, and whispered rumors. During his time working various jobs around the county, he'd developed a network of information that most white folks never suspected existed. Former slaves talked to each other, shared warnings, passed along observations about the changing world around them. And what Elijah had learned about Clara Whitmore's situation had filled him with a growing sense of dread. He remembered the first time he'd seen her 3 months ago, when he'd been hired to repair some fencing near the big house. She'd been sitting on the porch reading a book, but there had been something wrong with the picture. The way she'd glanced nervously at the windows behind her, the way she'd quickly hidden the book when footsteps approached, the way she'd seemed more like a prisoner than a beloved family member. Clara's hands trembled as she stood there, her eyes darting between the bidders like a trapped animal. Elijah could see the moment when understanding dawned on her face. She wasn't being transferred to family friends or distant relatives. She was being sold. The realization hit her like a physical blow, and she swayed slightly on her feet before steadying herself with visible effort. "Do I hear $50? Morrison's voice cut through Elijah's thoughts, bringing him back to the horrible present. "50!" called out a voice from the crowd. Elijah turned to see Thomas Brennan, a local merchant known for his cruelty toward his workers. The man's eyes gleamed with something that made Elijah's stomach turn, a look he'd seen too many times during his years in bondage, the look of a predator sizing up its prey. Brennan was a man who had grown wealthy during the war by selling supplies to both sides, and since the war's end he'd been buying up property and businesses throughout the county. Elijah had heard disturbing stories about the conditions in Brennan's textile mill, where workers, mostly former slaves, labored for wages so low they could barely survive, trapped by debts that seemed to grow rather than shrink no matter how hard they worked. 60. Another voice joined in, a stranger Elijah didn't recognize. A well-dressed man with cold eyes who had the look of someone accustomed to owning people. Clara's breathing became shallow and rapid as she stood there, her eyes darting between the bidders like a trapped animal. Elijah could see the moment when understanding dawned on her face. She wasn't being transferred to family friends or distant relatives. She was being sold. The realization hit her like a physical blow, and she swayed slightly on her feet. $75! Brennan's voice rose above the murmur of the crowd, and Elijah could hear the satisfaction in it. The man was enjoying this, relishing the power he held over another human being's fate. Elijah felt his heart pounding against his ribs. The money in his pocket, every cent he'd saved from 2 years of backbreaking labor in the sawmill, suddenly felt heavier than lead. He'd been saving for land, for a future, for the chance to build something permanent for his community. The small plot he'd been negotiating to buy would have given him the foundation to start a farm, maybe even help other freed families get established. But looking at Clara's terrified face, seeing the way her hands shook as she tried to maintain her composure, he knew there was only one choice he could make. This wasn't just about saving one person. It was about standing up to a system that was trying to drag them all back into bondage through legal manipulation and economic coercion. $100. Elijah's voice rang out clear and strong across the courthouse square. The crowd fell silent, as if a thunderclap had struck. Heads turned, eyes widened, and whispers began to spread like wildfire. A Negro bidding on a white woman. The very idea seemed to defy the natural order that so many still clung to, even in this new world of supposed freedom. Elijah could feel the weight of every stare, the hostility radiating from some quarters of the crowd like heat from a forge. He'd known this moment would come eventually, the moment when he'd have to choose between safety and doing what was right. His father had faced similar moments during their years in bondage, small acts of defiance that had sometimes meant the difference between life and death for their fellow slaves. Morrison's gavel hesitated in midair, his face flushing red with uncertainty. "Did you say 100, boy?" The word boy hung in the air like a slap, but Elijah had heard worse and survived. He stepped forward, his spine straight as an arrow, drawing on every ounce of dignity his father had taught him to maintain, even in the darkest times. "I said $100, sir, and I have the money right here." He pulled out a worn leather pouch, the coins inside clinking together like a metallic heartbeat. Each coin represented hours of sweat under the Georgia sun, splinters in his hands from handling rough lumber, and dreams of a better future that he was now willing to sacrifice for a stranger's freedom. Brennan's face flushed red with indignation, his carefully maintained composure cracking to reveal the rage beneath. "This is preposterous. You can't seriously consider—" "The law is the law," Morrison interrupted, though his voice carried reluctance and his eyes darted nervously between Brennan and the crowd. "If he has the money." The auctioneer was clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but federal oversight of such proceedings had made it dangerous to openly discriminate, even when every instinct told him to reject Elijah's bid. The Freedman's Bureau had agents throughout the region, and word of irregularities could bring unwanted federal attention. 110, Brennan shouted, desperation creeping into his voice. His carefully laid plans were unraveling before his eyes, and Elijah could see the calculation in the man's expression as he weighed the cost of continuing against the value of what he hoped to gain. Elijah closed his eyes for a moment, thinking of the small cabin he'd planned to build, the plot of land he'd dreamed of owning, the future he'd envisioned for himself and his community. Then he opened them and looked directly at Clara, whose green eyes were now fixed on him with a mixture of hope and bewilderment. In her face, he saw something that reminded him of his own reflection in the mirror on the day he'd first tasted freedom. Confusion, fear, and a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare was finally over. But he also saw intelligence there, a sharp awareness that suggested she understood more about her situation than anyone had given her credit for. $150, Elijah said quietly, but his voice carried across the silent square like thunder. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Brennan opened his mouth to bid again, but the look in Elijah's eyes, a look that spoke of determination forged in the fires of bondage and tempered by the hammer of freedom, made him think twice. There was something in that gaze that suggested this wasn't just about money, that Elijah would keep bidding until he had nothing left. Going once, going twice. Morrison's gavel hung in the air like a sword of Damocles. The auctioneer's voice wavered slightly, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was about to do. Sold to the Negro for $150. The crowd erupted in a mixture of outrage, confusion, and shocked murmurs. Some voices rose in anger, others in disbelief, and a few, very few, in what might have been approval. Elijah walked forward through the parting crowd, feeling their stares like physical weights on his shoulders. Each step took tremendous effort, but he forced himself to move with the same dignity he'd maintained throughout the proceedings. As Morrison handed him the papers with shaking hands, Clara stepped down from the platform on unsteady legs. She approached Elijah with cautious steps, her eyes searching his face for answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crowd's noise. "Why would you do this? You don't even know me." Elijah looked into her eyes and saw something that reminded him of his own reflection in the mirror on the day he'd first tasted freedom. Confusion, fear, and a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare was finally over. "Miss Clara," he said gently, "I know more than you might think. And right now, we need to get you somewhere safe so I can explain." As they walked away from the courthouse, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows of the general store. A man in an expensive suit whose eyes followed their every move with the cold calculation of a predator whose prey had just slipped from his grasp. The man's name was Judge Caldwell, and he had been expecting a very different outcome from today's proceedings. The real game was just beginning, and the stakes were higher than either Clara or Elijah could have imagined. The small cabin that Elijah called home sat on the outskirts of Freedman's town, a growing community of former slaves who had banded together to build new lives from the ashes of their bondage. The one-room structure was modest but clean, with hand-hewn furniture and a stone fireplace that Clara found herself staring at as she tried to process the events of the morning. The journey to the cabin had been tense and silent, with Clara walking beside Elijah through the dusty streets, while curious and sometimes hostile eyes followed their progress. She had never walked through town as anything other than Henry Whitmore's ward, always accompanied by a servant or family member, always protected by the invisible shield of her assumed status. Now, walking beside a black man who had just purchased her freedom, she felt exposed and vulnerable in ways she had never experienced. Freedman's town itself was a revelation to Clara. She had heard about it. Of course, whispered conversations in the big house had often turned to the problem of former slaves establishing their own communities. But seeing it firsthand was different. The small houses were simple but well-maintained, with gardens where families grew their own vegetables and children playing in yards that belonged to their parents. There was a sense of purpose and hope here that she had never encountered before. "Please sit," Elijah said, gesturing to one of the two chairs he'd made himself. The furniture was rough but sturdy, crafted with the same careful attention to detail that Clara had noticed in everything about Elijah's demeanor. "I imagine you have questions." Clara remained standing, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold her world together. The cabin was smaller than the servants' quarters at the plantation, but it felt different. It felt free. There were books on a small shelf, a Bible worn smooth from handling, and papers covered with what looked like careful calculations and planning. "Questions? Mr. Turner, I don't even know where to begin. Why did you spend your life savings on me? What do you want from me?" Her voice carried a tremor that she couldn't quite control, years of uncertainty and fear finally finding expression. Elijah poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup and offered it to her. When she didn't take it, he set it on the small table and took a step back, giving her space. The gesture was so different from what she was used to. No one had ever asked her permission for anything, never given her the choice to accept or refuse even the smallest kindness. "What I want, Miss Clara, is to tell you the truth. Something I suspect you haven't heard much of in your life." The truth? Clara's voice carried a bitter edge that surprised even her. The truth is that I just watched myself get sold like a piece of furniture. The truth is that the man I called Uncle Henry, the man who raised me after my parents died, left instructions for me to be. She couldn't finish the sentence, the words sticking in her throat like thorns. To be transferred to Thomas Brennan under a guardianship contract, Elijah finished quietly. Their contract that would have given him complete control over your life, your property and your freedom. Clara's eyes snapped to his, and for the first time since leaving the courthouse, she felt a spark of something other than fear. How could you possibly know that? Elijah walked to a small wooden box on his mantel and retrieved a folded piece of paper. The box itself was beautifully crafted, with intricate carvings that spoke of hours of patient work. Because I've been watching, Miss Clara, listening, learning, and what I've learned is that the Whitmore plantation never really stopped operating the way it always had. He unfolded the paper, a crude map drawn in pencil, with names and dates scrawled in the margins. The map showed not just Millbrook County, but the surrounding areas, with lines connecting various properties and names. It was the work of someone who had been methodically documenting a pattern that others had missed or chosen to ignore. For the past 6 months, I've been tracking something. People in our community have been disappearing. Not violently, not obviously, they just vanish. And when I started asking questions, I found out they'd all signed contracts. Work contracts, debt contracts, guardianship papers. Clara took the paper with trembling hands, studying the careful notations and connections. I don't understand. Slavery is over. The war ended slavery as it was, Elijah interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won knowledge. But it didn't end the desire to control free labor. It just made people more creative about how they do it. He moved closer, pointing to specific entries on the map. See, after the war, a lot of folks thought freedom meant they could just walk away and start over somewhere else. But freedom without resources, without education, without legal protection, that's not really freedom at all. It's just a different kind of trap. Clara's mind raced as she studied the map. Some of the names were familiar, people she remembered from the plantation, workers who had seemed happy to gain their freedom and start new lives. These names, some of these people, I remember them from the plantation, but they were freed, they left. They were brought back, Elijah said grimly, legally, with papers that looked official and contracts that seemed fair. And the man orchestrating it all was your Uncle Henry. The cup slipped from Clara's hands, shattering on the wooden floor. The sound seemed to echo in the small space, and Clara stared at the broken pieces as if they represented the fragments of everything she had believed about her life. That's impossible. Uncle Henry was kind to me. He educated me, treated me like family. He treated you like a valuable asset, Elijah said, his voice gentle but firm. Think about it, Miss Clara. Did you ever have your own money? Could you leave the plantation whenever you wanted? Did you have any legal documents in your own name? Clara sank into the chair, her mind racing through memories she'd never questioned before. The locked doors at night that she'd been told were for her protection. The way conversations stopped when she entered a room. The strange looks from visitors who seemed surprised to see her there. The way Uncle Henry had always insisted on handling all her correspondence, even letters from distant relatives. I thought he was protecting me, she whispered. After my parents died in that carriage accident, he took me in. He said I was like a daughter to him. What do you remember about your parents' death? Elijah asked gently. Clara looked up, startled by the question. It was an accident. Their carriage overturned on the way back from town. Uncle Henry said they were killed instantly. And their property? Their money? Uncle Henry said there were debts, that everything had to be sold to pay what they owed. Clara's voice grew smaller as she spoke, as if she were finally hearing her own words and recognizing how little sense they made. Elijah knelt beside her chair, his voice soft but urgent. Miss Clara, I've been asking questions about your family too. Your father owned one of the most successful cotton farms in the county. He had money in banks in Atlanta and Savannah. There's no way he died in debt. The words hit Clara like physical blows. Everything she had believed about her life, about her family, about the man who had raised her. All of it was crumbling around her like a house built on sand. "The letters," she whispered suddenly, her face going pale. "What letters?" Clara looked up at Elijah, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. "I helped Uncle Henry with his correspondence. I have good handwriting, and he said it was part of my education. But some of the letters, they were about contracts, about people owing money. I thought it was just business, but..." She stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, she could see children playing in the dusty street, their laughter carrying on the warm afternoon air. It was such a normal scene, but it felt like something from another world, a world where children could play freely because their parents truly owned their own lives. There was a ledger. Uncle Henry kept it locked in his desk, but sometimes he'd have me copy numbers from it, names and amounts. I thought they were debts people owed the plantation, but what if they were debts the plantation claimed people owed? Elijah finished. Debts that could be used to force them back into bondage. Clara turned from the window, her face a mask of anguish. "If what you're saying is true, then I helped him. I wrote those letters. I copied those numbers. I was part of it." Elijah crossed the room and gently took her hands in his. His hands were rough from years of hard labor, but his touch was gentle, respectful in a way that no man's touch had ever been before. "You were a prisoner, Miss Clara. A prisoner who didn't even know she was in a cage. But now you're free and you have a choice to make." "What choice?" "Help me stop them. Help me save the people whose names are on that map. Help me make sure that what happened to you, what almost happened to you, doesn't happen to anyone else." Clara stared into Elijah's eyes and saw something she'd never seen before in a man's gaze. Not possession, not control, but respect. He was asking for her help, not demanding her obedience. For the first time in her life, someone was treating her as an equal, as a person capable of making her own decisions. "The ledger," she said suddenly, her voice growing stronger. "If it's still in Uncle Henry's desk, it would have everything. Names, amounts, dates, proof of what they've been doing." Elijah nodded. "The plantation house is being cleared out this week. If we're going to get that ledger, it has to be soon." "We?" Clara asked, and there was something in her voice that hadn't been there before, a note of determination, of purpose. "Only if you want to," Elijah said. "I won't force you to do anything, Miss Clara. You're free now, truly free. The choice is yours." Clara looked around the small cabin, at the simple furniture, the clean but worn clothes hanging on pegs, the Bible on the table. It was humble, but it was honest. It was real in a way that her life at the plantation had never been. Here was a man who had sacrificed everything he had to give her a choice, asking nothing in return except the chance to fight for justice. "My name is Clara," she said quietly. "Just Clara. And yes, I want to help." Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Neither of them knew that at that very moment, Thomas Brennan was meeting with a group of men in the back room of the Millbrook Hotel, planning how to reclaim what they considered their rightful property. The storm was coming, and it would test everything they believed about freedom, justice, and the courage required to fight for both. But for now, in the safety of Elijah's cabin, two people who had been strangers that morning were forging a partnership that would change not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone in their community. The real fight was about to begin. The Whitmore plantation house stood like a monument to a dying world, its white columns gleaming in the moonlight as Clara and Elijah approached through the overgrown gardens. 3 days had passed since the auction, and the house had been mostly cleared of its contents, but Clara knew that Henry Whitmore had always kept his most important documents in the hidden compartment of his desk, a secret she'd discovered as a child and never mentioned to anyone. The past 3 days had been a whirlwind of planning and preparation. Elijah had introduced Clara to other members of the Freedman's town community, people whose stories had opened her eyes to the reality of life for former slaves in the post-war South. She had met Sarah Washington, whose husband Samuel had disappeared 6 months earlier after signing what he thought was a simple work contract. She had spoken with elderly Moses Freeman, who had been forced to sign over his small plot of land to pay a debt that had mysteriously appeared on legal documents he couldn't read. Each story had added another piece to the puzzle, another confirmation that what they were fighting was not just individual greed, but a systematic attempt to recreate slavery under the guise of legal contracts and economic necessity. Clara had spent hours helping Elijah map out the connections, her education and familiarity with legal language proving invaluable in understanding the scope of the conspiracy. "The servants' entrance is around back," Clara whispered as they crept through the shadows of the oak trees. "The lock has been broken for years, but Uncle Henry never fixed it because no one else knew about it." The gardens that had once been her playground now seemed ominous and threatening. Overgrown hedges created deep shadows where anyone could be hiding, and every rustle of leaves in the night breeze made her heart race. She had never approached the house like this, as an intruder, a thief in the night. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now breaking into the place that had been her prison for so many years. Elijah followed her lead, his heart pounding with each step. They'd spent the last 3 days planning this moment, going over every detail of the house's layout and timing their approach for when the caretaker would be making his rounds in town. But knowing the plan and executing it were two different things entirely. The journey through the gardens brought back a flood of memories for Clara. Here was the rose arbor where she had spent countless hours reading, always under the watchful eye of a servant who had been instructed never to let her wander too far. There was the old oak tree where she had carved her initials as a child, dreaming of a future that had seemed as distant and impossible as the stars. Now, creeping through these same gardens as a fugitive, she realized how naive those dreams had been. She had imagined growing up, getting married, having children, but always within the confines of the world Henry Whitmore had created for her. She had never imagined true freedom, never conceived of a life where her choices would be her own. The servant's door opened with a soft creak that sounded like thunder in the stillness of the night. Clara led the way through the narrow hallway, her feet finding their path by memory even in the darkness. The familiar smell of the house, lavender and old wood and something indefinably sad, brought back a flood of memories that threatened to overwhelm her. Every step through the darkened hallways was like walking through a graveyard of her former life. Here was the kitchen where she had learned to cook under the stern supervision of Aunt Bessie, the cook who had been sold away when Clara was 15. There was the back staircase she had used to sneak down to the library when she was supposed to be sleeping, hungry for books that Uncle Henry deemed inappropriate for young ladies. "This way," she breathed, guiding Elijah toward the study. The study had always been Henry Whitmore's sanctuary, the place where he conducted his business and made the decisions that affected the lives of everyone on the plantation. Clara had been allowed inside only when summoned, usually to help with correspondence or to receive instruction in what Uncle Henry called her duties as a lady. Now, entering it as an intruder, she saw it with new eyes, not as a place of learning and refinement, but as the command center of a system designed to control and exploit human beings. The study door was ajar, and moonlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the room. Henry Whitmore's desk sat in the center like an altar to his memory, its surface cleared of everything except a thin layer of dust. The walls were lined with law books and ledgers, the tools of a man who had used knowledge and legal manipulation to maintain power long after the world had supposedly changed around him. Clara knelt beside the desk and ran her fingers along its edge until she found the small hidden latch. The secret compartment had been her discovery during a particularly boring afternoon when she was 12 years old. She had been dusting the study under supervision when she had noticed that one section of the desk's molding didn't quite match the rest. Her curiosity had led her to discover the hidden space, but she had been wise enough even then to keep the knowledge to herself. The secret compartment opened with a soft click, revealing a leather-bound ledger and a stack of papers tied with a black ribbon. The ledger was thick and well-worn, its pages filled with Henry Whitmore's careful handwriting. The papers beneath it were correspondence, legal documents, and what appeared to be contracts and agreements. "This is it," she whispered, lifting out the ledger with trembling hands. Elijah lit a small candle and held it close as Clara opened the book. Page after page revealed the scope of Henry Whitmore's operation: names, dates, amounts owed, and most damning of all, notes about how to manipulate the legal system to keep people trapped in cycles of debt and servitude. The ledger was a masterpiece of systematic oppression, documenting not just individual cases, but the entire methodology of legal enslavement. There were notes on which judges could be bribed, which officials could be intimidated, and which legal loopholes could be exploited. It was clear that Henry Whitmore had spent years developing this system, refining it through trial and error, until he had created what he believed to be the perfect way to maintain control over a supposedly free population. "Look at this," Clara said, pointing to an entry dated just 2 months earlier. "Samuel Washington, the man you mentioned. It says here that his debt was artificially inflated by charging him for damages to property he never touched and interest at rates that would make a bank robber blush." The entry was detailed and methodical, showing how Samuel's original debt of $20 for tools and supplies had been manipulated through false charges and compound interest until it reached nearly $200. There were notes about how to make the charges seem legitimate, which witnesses to call, and how to ensure that Samuel would never be able to challenge the debt in court. Elijah studied the entries, his anger growing with each revelation. And here, they've got a whole system worked out. They target people who can't read well, who don't understand legal language. They make the contract sound fair, but the fine print is designed to trap them. Clara turned the page and gasped, "Elijah, look at this." There, in Henry Whitmore's careful handwriting, was a list titled Future Acquisitions. Elijah's name was at the top, followed by those of his sister, his brother-in-law, and dozens of other members of the Freedman's town community. Next to each name were notes about their assets, their vulnerabilities, and the specific strategies that would be used to trap them. "They were planning to come for all of us," Elijah said, his voice barely controlled. "One by one, they were going to find ways to drag us back into bondage." The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. It wasn't just about individual greed or local corruption. It was a systematic attempt to undermine the entire concept of freedom for former slaves. The ledger showed connections to similar operations in other counties, other states, all working together to create a network of legal slavery that would be virtually impossible for individual victims to challenge. "There's more," Clara said, her voice shaking as she read from a letter tucked between the pages. "This is correspondence with Thomas Brennan. They were planning to use me as bait. They knew I'd seen the records, heard the conversations. Brennan was supposed to marry me and then claimed that as my husband, he had the right to all the information I possessed. If I refused to cooperate or tried to expose them, he could have me declared mentally unfit and committed to an asylum." The letter was written in Brennan's hand, and its casual discussion of Clara's fate, as if she were a piece of property to be manipulated, made Elijah's blood boil. The plan was detailed and thorough, covering every possible contingency and showing a level of calculation that was truly chilling. The candle flickered in Elijah's trembling hand. They had it all planned out, every angle covered. "Not every angle," Clara said, looking up at him with fierce determination. "They didn't plan on you." A sound from the front of the house made them both freeze. The creak of floorboards, the soft thud of footsteps. Someone was in the house. Clara quickly gathered the ledger and papers, stuffing them into a cloth bag she'd brought for the purpose. They could hear voices now, low and urgent, coming from the front hall. "Sure they came this way?" "Saw them heading toward the house not 20 minutes ago. Brennan wants them found." The voices were getting closer, and Clara could hear the heavy footsteps of multiple men moving through the house. They had been discovered, and from the sound of it, their pursuers were armed and determined. Clara grabbed Elijah's hand and led him toward the window. "We can climb down the trellis," she whispered. "I used to sneak out this way when I was younger." But as they reached the window, they could see torches moving through the gardens below. They were surrounded. The men outside were positioned to catch anyone trying to escape through the grounds, while the searchers inside were systematically checking every room. "The attic," Clara said suddenly. "There's a way out through the roof. "Follow me." They crept through the house like ghosts, Clara's intimate knowledge of every creaking board and loose floorboard guiding them safely past the searchers below. The narrow stairs to the attic were hidden behind a door that looked like part of the wall paneling, another secret Clara had discovered in her lonely childhood explorations. The attic was stifling hot and filled with the detritus of generations, old furniture, trunks of clothes, and boxes of papers that would have told their own stories if anyone had cared to read them. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old wood and forgotten memories. Clara led Elijah to a small window at the far end, one that opened onto a section of roof that connected to the old slave quarters. "From there we can get to the woods," she explained as she struggled with the window latch. "But Elijah, even if we get away, what then? They know we were here. They'll know we have the ledger." The window was stuck, swollen from years of humidity and neglect. Elijah helped her with it, putting his shoulder against the frame while she worked the latch. Below them, they could hear the searchers getting closer, their voices growing more urgent as they realized their quarry had eluded them. Elijah helped her with the window, his mind racing through possibilities. "Then we make sure everyone knows what's in it. We take this to the Freedmen's Bureau, to the federal authorities, to anyone who will listen. And if they don't listen, if they decide that the word of a former slave and a woman with no legal standing isn't worth the paper it's written on." The question hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of all the injustices they had witnessed and experienced. They both knew that the legal system was still heavily biased against people like them, that even with evidence, getting justice would be an uphill battle. The window finally gave way and cool night air rushed into the stifling attic. Elijah looked at Clara, seeing in her face the same determination that had carried him through the darkest days of his bondage. "Then we make them listen," he said simply. "We make so much noise that they can't ignore us. We tell everyone, the newspapers, the churches, the other freedmen's communities. We make this story so big that they can't bury it." Clara nodded, clutching the bag of evidence to her chest. The weight of the ledger felt like the weight of history itself, the documented proof of a system that was trying to drag them all back into darkness. "Together?" she asked, and in that single word was all the hope and fear and determination that had brought them to this moment. "Together," Elijah confirmed. They climbed out onto the roof just as shouts erupted from the study below. Their absence had been discovered, and the hunt was intensifying. Moving carefully across the slippery shingles, they made their way toward freedom and the fight of their lives. Behind them, Thomas Brennan's voice rose above the others, filled with rage and frustration. "Find them! I don't care if you have to tear this county apart, find them!" But Clara and Elijah were already disappearing into the woods, carrying with them the evidence that would either set their people free or get them all killed in the attempt. The real battle was about to begin, and they both knew that there would be no turning back from the path they had chosen. The Freedmen's Bureau office in Atlanta was a modest building that had seen better days, but to Clara and Elijah, it represented their last hope for justice. They had traveled for 2 days, sleeping in the woods and moving only at night to reach the federal authorities who might actually have the power to act on the evidence they carried. The journey to Atlanta had been harrowing and exhausting. They had been forced to avoid main roads and towns, traveling through forests and along creek beds to evade the search parties that Brennan had organized. Clara had never experienced anything like it, sleeping on the ground, eating cold food, constantly looking over her shoulder for signs of pursuit. But she had also never felt more alive, more purposeful, than she did carrying the evidence that could free dozens of people from a new form of bondage. Along the way, they had encountered other travelers, some friendly, others suspicious or hostile. They had posed as husband and wife when necessary, a deception that had felt strange and uncomfortable at first, but had gradually become more natural. Elijah had been unfailingly respectful and protective, never taking advantage of their situation, despite the intimacy forced upon them by their circumstances. Captain James Morrison, no relation to the auctioneer, was a Union veteran who had stayed in Georgia to help implement Reconstruction policies. His weathered face and missing left arm told the story of someone who had paid a personal price for the cause of freedom. And his reputation for fairness had preceded him even to the remote corners of Millbrook County. The captain's office was spartanly furnished, but organized with military precision. Maps of Georgia covered one wall, marked with pins and notes that tracked the progress of reconstruction efforts throughout the state. His desk was covered with reports and correspondence, evidence of the enormous task of rebuilding a society from the ground up. "This is quite an accusation you're making," Captain Morrison said as he studied the ledger spread across his desk. The morning sun streamed through the office windows, illuminating page after page of Henry Whitmore's careful documentation of his illegal activities. The captain had been reading for over an hour, his expression growing darker with each page. Occasionally he would stop to make notes or to ask Clara to clarify a particular entry, but for the most part he read in grim silence, the weight of what he was seeing clearly affecting him deeply. "It's not an accusation, sir," Elijah said respectfully but firmly. "It's evidence. Every name in that book represents a person who was tricked back into bondage through fraudulent contracts and manipulated debt." Clara sat beside Elijah, her hands folded in her lap, but her eyes blazing with determination. The past few days had changed her in ways she was still discovering. The frightened, confused woman who had stood on the auction block was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own power and was willing to use it for justice. "I can testify to the authenticity of these documents, Captain. I helped create some of them, though I didn't understand what I was doing at the time." Captain Morrison looked up from the ledger, his grey eyes studying Clara's face with the intensity of a man accustomed to judging character under pressure. "Miss Whitmore, you understand that your testimony could put you in considerable danger. These men you're accusing, they have money, influence, connections. They also have my friends and neighbors trapped in a system that's slavery in everything but name," Clara replied, her voice steady and strong. "I've been complicit in that system through my ignorance. I won't be complicit through my silence." The captain nodded slowly, recognizing the steel beneath Clara's refined exterior. He had seen that same determination in the eyes of soldiers who had faced impossible odds and refused to surrender. It was the look of someone who had found something worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. He turned to a map on his wall, one that showed the entire southeastern United States marked with various colored pins. "We've been hearing rumors about this kind of activity throughout the region, sharecropping contracts that never allow the debt to be paid off, guardianship arrangements that strip people of their legal rights, work agreements that amount to indentured servitude. But we've never had proof this comprehensive." The map told a story of systematic oppression that extended far beyond Millbrook County. Red pins marked locations where similar schemes had been reported. Yellow pins showed areas under investigation, and green pins indicated places where successful prosecutions had taken place. The pattern was clear. What they had uncovered was part of a much larger conspiracy. He walked back to his desk and picked up one of the letters from Henry Whitmore's correspondence. This letter here, to Judge Caldwell in Millbrook, it's essentially a bribe. Whitmore is offering to fund the judge's re-election campaign in exchange for favorable rulings on debt collection cases. "Judge Caldwell is the one who would have ruled on my guardianship transfer to Thomas Brennan," Clara said quietly. "The fix was in from the beginning. The letter was written in code that was transparent once you understood the context. References to campaign contributions and mutual support were clearly bribes, while discussions of legal precedents and community standards were instructions on how to rule in specific cases." Captain Morrison sat down heavily in his chair, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. "The problem is, even with this evidence, prosecuting these men won't be easy. The local authorities are either bought off or sympathetic to the old ways. We'll need federal intervention, and that means convincing my superiors in Washington that this is worth their attention." "What would it take to get their attention?" Elijah asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Witnesses, living witnesses who are willing to testify about what happened to them. And we'd need to catch these men in the act of implementing their schemes." Clara and Elijah exchanged glances. They had discussed this possibility during their journey to Atlanta, knowing it would likely come to this. The evidence in the ledger was damning, but it was also historical, proof of past crimes rather than ongoing ones. To build a case that would stand up in federal court, They would need to catch the conspirators in the act. What if we could give you both? Clara asked. Captain Morrison raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? The ledger shows that they're planning to move against several families in Freedman's town next week, Elijah explained. They're going to claim that these families owe money for improvements to their cabins, improvements that were actually paid for by the families themselves. If we could warn the families and have federal agents present when Brennan and his men try to serve the fraudulent papers, you'd catch them red-handed, the captain finished. But it would be dangerous. If they suspect a trap, they might resort to violence. The plan was risky, but it was also their best chance to gather the kind of evidence that would be impossible to dismiss or ignore. Federal agents witnessing the crimes as they happened would carry far more weight than historical documents, no matter how damning. They're already resorting to violence, Clara said. It's just the slow violence of legal theft instead of the quick violence of whips and chains. Captain Morrison studied the map again, his mind working through the logistics and implications of what they were proposing. I'll send a telegram to Washington today. If I can get authorization for a federal operation, we'll do this. But I want both of you to understand, once we start this, there's no going back. These men will stop at nothing to protect their operation. We understand, Elijah said. But Captain, there's something else you should know. According to the ledger, this isn't just happening in Millbrook County. Whitmore was corresponding with similar operations in at least 6 other counties across Georgia and Alabama. This is bigger than just one plantation. The weight of that revelation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Captain Morrison walked to his window and stared out at the busy Atlanta street, where former slaves and former masters were still learning how to exist in the same world. The street below was a microcosm of the larger struggle taking place throughout the South. Former slaves walked alongside their former masters, but the relationships were still defined by the old hierarchies and prejudices. True equality remained a distant goal, and the evidence they had uncovered showed just how determined some people were to prevent that goal from ever being achieved. If what you're telling me is true, he said finally, then we're not just talking about a few corrupt individuals. We're talking about a systematic attempt to undermine the entire Reconstruction effort. Yes, sir, Clara said. That's exactly what we're talking about. The implications were staggering. If similar operations were active throughout the South, it meant that thousands of former slaves were being systematically re-enslaved through legal manipulation. The promise of freedom that had been won through 4 years of bloody war was being stolen through contracts and courtrooms. Captain Morrison turned back to them, and they could see the soldier in him rising to meet the challenge. Then we're going to stop them. All of them. 3 days later, Clara and Elijah were back in Millbrook County, but they weren't alone. Hidden in the woods around Freedman's town were a dozen federal agents, armed with warrants and the authority to make arrests. The trap was set, and everyone involved understood that the next few hours would determine not just their own fates, but the fate of Reconstruction itself. The night before the operation, Clara and Elijah had met with the families who were targeted for Brennan's next wave of legal enslavement. The meetings had been emotional and difficult, as people who had thought they were finally free learned that their freedom was once again under threat. But they had also been inspiring as the community came together to support each other and to fight back against injustice. Thomas Brennan arrived at dawn with a group of armed men and a stack of legal papers. He expected to find a community of frightened former slaves who would submit to his authority without question. Instead, he found Elijah Turner standing in the center of the town square, surrounded by his neighbors and backed by the full power of the federal government. The morning was crisp and clear, with a hint of autumn in the air that seemed to promise change and renewal. The entire community had gathered in the square, not in fear but in solidarity. Children who should have been playing were standing with their parents, understanding instinctively that this moment would determine their future. "Thomas Brennan," Captain Morrison announced, stepping out from behind one of the cabins with his badge gleaming in the morning sun. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to violate the civil rights of freed persons, fraud and corruption of public officials." The look of shock and rage on Brennan's face was something Clara would remember for the rest of her life. For a moment, it seemed like he might try to fight, But the sight of federal agents emerging from every hiding place in the town convinced him that resistance was futile. His carefully constructed world of legal manipulation and economic coercion was crumbling around him, and he could see in the faces of the people he had tried to re-enslave that his power over them was broken forever. As the arrests were made and the evidence was catalogued, Clara found herself standing beside Elijah, watching the end of a nightmare that had haunted her community for too long. The federal agents were professional and thorough, documenting everything and ensuring that the case they built would be unassailable in court. "What happens now?" she asked, watching as Brennan and his associates were led away in chains. Elijah looked around at the faces of his neighbors, people who had lived in fear for months, never knowing when they might be dragged back into bondage by legal trickery. Now they stood tall, their freedom secured not just by law but by their own courage, and the courage of a woman who had chosen justice over safety. "Now we build," he said simply. "We build the kind of community where this can never happen again. We build schools so our children can read every contract they're asked to sign. We build businesses so we're not dependent on the charity or manipulation of others. We build a future that's truly free." Clara nodded, feeling for the first time in her life that she truly belonged somewhere. The community that surrounded her was not bound by blood or tradition, but by shared values and mutual support. It was a family she had chosen, and that had chosen her in return. "Together?" she asked, and in that word was all the hope and determination that had brought them through their darkest hours. "Together," Elijah confirmed, and in that word was the promise of everything they had fought for: freedom, justice, and the chance to write their own story. The sun rose higher over Freedman's town, illuminating a community that had faced its greatest test and emerged stronger than ever. And in the distance, the sound of hammers could already be heard as the work of building that better future began. 6 months later. The small schoolhouse that Clara had helped design stood at the heart of Freedman's town, its bell tower reaching toward a sky that seemed brighter than it had in years. Inside, children who might have grown up illiterate were learning to read and write, while their parents attended evening classes to ensure they would never again be vulnerable to the kind of legal trickery that had nearly destroyed their community. The schoolhouse was more than just a building. It was a symbol of everything the community had fought to achieve. Built with lumber donated by sympathetic merchants and labor provided by every able-bodied person in town, it represented the collective determination to create a better future for their children. Clara stood at the front of the classroom, teaching a group of adults how to read contracts and legal documents. Beside her, Elijah helped those who struggled with the more complex language, his patience and gentle encouragement helping them overcome years of being told they weren't smart enough to understand such things. The evening classes had become one of the most important institutions in Freedman's town. Men and women who had worked all day in fields and factories would gather in the schoolhouse to learn the skills that would protect them from exploitation. They studied not just reading and writing, but basic mathematics, legal principles, and their rights as citizens. The trials had been swift and decisive. Thomas Brennan and his associates were sentenced to federal prison, while Judge Caldwell was removed from the bench and disbarred. The evidence from Henry Whitmore's ledger had led to similar prosecutions across the South, dealing a significant blow to the network of corruption that had threatened to undermine Reconstruction. But perhaps more importantly, the story of what had happened in Millbrook County had spread throughout the region, inspiring other communities to stand up for their rights and demand the freedom that was rightfully theirs. Newspapers had picked up the story, churches had preached sermons about it, and politicians had been forced to address the systematic attempts to re-enslave freed people. The ripple effects of their courage had extended far beyond their small community. Federal legislation had been strengthened to close the loopholes that men like Brennan had exploited, and new oversight mechanisms had been put in place to prevent similar schemes from taking root. As the evening class ended and the students filed out into the warm Georgia night, Clara and Elijah found themselves alone in the schoolhouse they had helped create. The simple wooden desks and hand-drawn maps represented so much hope and hard work, so much sacrifice and determination to build something better from the ashes of the old world. The walls of the schoolhouse were decorated with the students' work, maps they had drawn of their community, essays they had written about their dreams for the future, and certificates marking their progress in reading and mathematics. Each piece represented not just individual achievement, but collective triumph over a system that had tried to keep them ignorant and powerless. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked, looking around at the simple wooden desks and hand-drawn maps that represented so much hope and hard work. "Regret what?" Elijah replied, though he knew what she meant. "Spending your life savings on me, giving up your dream of owning land to save someone you barely knew." Elijah walked to the window and looked out at the thriving community that surrounded them. New houses with gardens where families grew their own food, small businesses that provided goods and services to their neighbors, and children playing in streets that belonged to them. The community had grown significantly in the months since the trials, as word spread about a place where former slaves could live in true freedom and safety. The land that Elijah had dreamed of owning had become something even better, a community where dozens of families owned their own plots, where children could grow up free, and where the principles of justice and equality were not just ideals but lived realities. "Clara," he said, turning back to her with a smile that lit up his entire face, "I got something better than land. I got a partner in building a future that's worth living in." Clara felt tears prick her eyes as she realized the truth of his words. She had spent her entire life feeling like she didn't belong anywhere, too white for the slave quarters, too poor and powerless for the big house, too honest for the world of corruption that had surrounded her. But here, in this simple schoolhouse, in this community of people who had chosen freedom over safety, she had found her home. The partnership between Clara and Elijah had become the foundation for something larger than either of them had imagined. Their different backgrounds and skills had complemented each other perfectly. Her education and familiarity with legal language, his practical knowledge and deep understanding of his community's needs. Together, they had created programs that addressed not just immediate problems, but long-term challenges. "Together?" she asked, echoing the word that had become their promise to each other and their community. "Together," Elijah confirmed, and as the last light of day faded into the peaceful darkness of a truly free night, they began planning the lessons for tomorrow, lessons that would ensure that the children of Freedman's Town would grow up knowing not just how to read and write, but how to recognize freedom when they saw it and fight for it when it was threatened. The schoolhouse had become more than just a place of learning. It was a beacon of hope that attracted visitors from across the region. Delegations from other communities came to study their methods and learn how to replicate their success. Government officials came to see what Reconstruction could accomplish when it was implemented with genuine commitment to justice and equality. But perhaps most importantly, it had become a place where the children of former slaves could dream of futures that their parents had never dared to imagine. In the evening classes, adults learned to read the contracts that had once been used to trap them. In the day classes, children learned mathematics and science and literature, preparing for careers as teachers and doctors and lawyers and business owners. The story that had begun with an unexpected purchase at an auction had become something much larger, a testament to the power of courage, the importance of truth, and the unbreakable bonds that form when people choose to stand together against injustice. Clara often thought about the moment when Elijah had stepped forward at that auction, risking everything he had to save a stranger. It had seemed like an act of individual heroism, but she now understood that it had been something more, a declaration that freedom was not something to be hoarded, but something to be shared, not something to be enjoyed in isolation, but something to be defended collectively. The community that had grown around that act of courage had become a model for what the post-war South could become. It was not perfect. There were still challenges, still setbacks, still people who resented their success and tried to undermine their progress. But it was real, and it was theirs, and it proved that the promises of freedom and equality were not just empty words but achievable goals. And in the years that followed, when people asked Clara and Elijah how they had found the strength to take on such powerful enemies, they would always give the same answer. We remembered that freedom isn't something you're given. It's something you take and something you protect, and something you share with everyone who needs it. The legacy of their courage lived on in every child who learned to read in their schoolhouse, every family that owned their own land, every person who stood up to injustice because they had seen that it was possible to win. The ripples of their actions spread far beyond Millbrook County, inspiring similar communities across the South and contributing to the slow but steady progress toward true equality. As Clara and Elijah locked up the schoolhouse and walked home through the quiet streets of Freedmanstown, they could see the lights in windows where families were gathered around dinner tables, where children were doing homework, where adults were reading newspapers and discussing the issues of the day. It was a simple scene, but it represented something revolutionary. A community of former slaves who had not just survived their transition to freedom, but had thrived, creating something beautiful and lasting from the ashes of bondage. The future stretched out before them, full of challenges but also full of possibilities. There would be more battles to fight, more injustices to confront, more people to help find their way to freedom. But they would face those challenges together, armed with the knowledge that courage and determination and solidarity could overcome even the most entrenched systems of oppression. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of courage, justice, and the human spirit that history tried to forget. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today.